So with that, I will turn to Jason and ask you to opine on the energy markets today. We've seen a lot of change. And I know that if I think about questions that I get from investors, they typically tend to be short-term, even though they're long-term investors, get moved a lot by the market. So where are we today? Are we lower for longer?
Well, today is much lower. I don't know how long it'll be, but this is a good day to be asking this question since oil prices literally fell off a cliff today. That's driven by concerns about the macro outlook, and OPEC today put out revised numbers that yet again reduced down the demand outlook, mostly driven by concerns about the macro picture. Also, this very interesting dynamic for anyone who thought energy geopolitics was dead. The decision to join Columbia and start a center focused on energy geopolitics 5 or 6 years ago when I came here is looking pretty good. We have a book series through Columbia University Press, and about 2 books a year we put out. And the first one, I think 3 years ago, was called Crude Volatility, a thesis for why we were in for more volatility rather than less in crude prices. And that is looking pretty good right now. That energy geopolitics is alive and well. It's remarkable how quickly the sentiment has shifted from one concerned with undersupply to oversupply, just in the span of a month or 2. I was at the last OPEC meeting in June, and the discussion there was about, you remember all of President Trump's tweets, his public and private pressure on producing countries, notably the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is the only country that really has a meaningful amount of spare capacity and has the ability to ramp production up and down in short time frames, to put more supply on the market, to make sure that prices didn't run up out of control beyond $85, $90 a barrel, and allowed room for the administration to take an incredibly tough line to zero out Iranian exports. We've also been writing for about a year about why we thought that would never happen. And just in the last few weeks, we saw that play out, that the administration gave exceptions to sanctions for Iranian exports. So although their exports will decline, certainly not to zero, I don't think anyone ever thought that was realistic. Maybe some people did. And then concerns about the macro outlook. U.S. shale is going through the roof, notwithstanding some of the infrastructure bottlenecks that people thought would exist. And so this would be the point at which producer countries, led by Saudi Arabia, and very interestingly now Russia, which is not a part of OPEC, but Saudi and Russia are really in the driver's seat of OPEC plus cooperation, would think about cutting back supplies. But as soon as they even hinted over the weekend at the meetings in Abu Dhabi that they might do that, again yesterday President Trump took to Twitter to caution people against cutting production and doing anything that would undermine what I think is his message for U.S. For the U.S. citizens, that he's doing all he can to help the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy is doing great, jobs are great, and low gasoline prices, I think, are part of that story in the White House's mind. And this is a particularly sensitive time for OPEC countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, to think about bringing attention to OPEC acting as a cartel, given the fact that Congress may look for additional actions to take in the coming months to respond to the killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And one of the options on the table is this legislation, NOPEC, that's been circulated for quite some time, that would remove immunity from antitrust action against OPEC countries. And that is a concern to OPEC countries. So there's this very interesting dynamic and interplay between the producer countries, non-producer countries like Russia, and the role that the U.S. is playing in this. And so all of that led today to concerns that they might not go as far to cut production as people thought, more Iranian supply than people thought, more U.S. supply than people thought, and macro concerns. So I think unless we see strong action to cut production at the December OPEC meeting, prices haven't not yet stopped falling.
Thank you. And I have a question just around our unique vantage point here in New York. Can sometimes get a little myopic when it comes to the use of fossil fuels globally. That, being in New York and San Francisco, can kind of take that position. What about the long-term demand outlook? Have we reached peak demand? Given that we have, softening economic growth, muddling through in advanced economies, we're seeing kind of the impact of the transition from old to new economic growth in China. would we eventually kind of meet peak demand in the next, like, say, 10 to 15 years?
Well, there's a lot of uncertainty about that, and it depends. You said fossil fuels, so it depends which fuel you're talking
Oil and
about.
gas,
Are we
let's
talking
say.
about oil, gas, or coal? They're very different.
Oil and gas.
All of them are rising. Coal went up last year. All the talk of coal is dead and coal is a dying fuel. Coal did pretty well last year. Coal prices did pretty well. If you were a company like Glencore interested in coal mining for the last decade, you're doing pretty well right now. So I think that's counter to the narrative people have that the world's moving away from coal. That is not the case in many parts of the developing world. I was in China last week, and we organized a series of discussions around their Belt and Road Initiative and where they're deploying capital to build energy infrastructure around the world. And there's a lot of coal planned for that, for countries that need access to expanding their energy use. I think the outlook for natural gas is very robust. That is, we're shifting heavily from pipeline to gas taken to the water, the rise of liquefied natural gas. In particular, by far, one of the largest areas for growth was China, which had a policy-driven push to move away from coal for pollution reasons last year and move from coal-fired boilers, and they mostly shifted toward natural gas to achieve that. Huge imports, 50% year-on-year growth in LNG imports, and they'll do that about again this year. Oil, I think, is a huge question. So the estimates for when oil demand peaks range from 5 or 6 years from now to 30 or 40 years from now, and a lot of uncertainty about the growth rate of alternatives, particularly electrification in the transport sector. I think the important thing to remember there is when you do the modeling of this and you do the numbers, it's just important to keep in mind how difficult it is to get demand to peak and start to decline. Passenger vehicles are about 20 or 25% of world oil demand. There's a lot of most of world oil demand has nothing to do with cars. And when you think about the ability to substitute, whether it's electrification or LNG or something else, into heavy-duty trucks, into the marine sector, into aviation, and then into petrochemicals, which is the most rapidly growing source of oil demand, it's a lot. And you're going to have much stronger technology push and a much stronger policy push.
Thank you. Turning to the macro and the markets, John, from your position in Riyadh, you've witnessed a major transition from the downturn in energy prices mid-2014 onwards. A lot of Middle Eastern policymakers would say privately that we needed an era of low growth to be able to stymie and inject some kind of fiscal responsibility, whether it was with regard to civil service or looking at government budgets. As well as things like introduction of VAT and the removal of fuel subsidies in Saudi Arabia. These are kind of landmark moves. First of all, do you think these are around to stay, and have they also contributed to a better macro environment for inbound investors?
I think yes and no. Prior to 2014, Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries had already been in discussion with the World Bank, the IFC, various international consultants, about diversification. I mean, there was always a view that obviously non-renewable resources are not renewable. And we saw what happened in Yemen, which decades ago had exhausted its oil supplies and then spiraled downwards into poverty and political and economic chaos and war. And the GCC countries recognizing that to avoid that, and that they needed to diversify their economies and look into alternative measures. I mean, I first came to the GCC in 2010 in Abu Dhabi, and then moved to Saudi Arabia in 2011. At that time, there was talk of diversifying the economy through, there was even talk of introducing an income tax, which still hasn't really died off. But I think that the oil crash in 2014, where you saw, I mean, the high, I believe, was around $155 a barrel, and then prices closed that year at about $76, $77 a barrel. So I mean, it was a pretty sharp wake-up call. That certainly did spur on this recognition that there's this existential threat out there, that we are an oil-dependent society, and we have 26 million people, and the UAE has some, 4 or 5 million residents, and we need to sustain them because these are welfare societies that are paying for the education of their students, the marriages of their nationals, scholarships across the world, and it's a very heavily state-run economy where most of the resources are driven from natural resources, unlike Western states where it's the ad caelum doctrine, where it's the owner of the land to the depths and to the skies who controls all the natural resources. I mean, this was and continues to be the major source of revenue. So I think the 2014 crisis was a wake-up call that did, as you say, drive these developments. And I think back in 2014 and 2015, I wouldn't have expected to see so quickly the implementation of the VAT across the GCC, which we saw happen this year, January 1, 2018. The GCC countries tend to be far more slow-moving, and so yes, that was one factor. The movement towards public-private partnerships, as opposed to the traditional model of purchasing and procurement, the traditional and historic model of spending across the GCC, and particularly in Saudi Arabia, has been to purchase goods and services. Through that has been how the defense sector, healthcare sector, energy sectors have essentially existed for the past decades. And today, that there's a major shift. The foundation of the Center for Public-Private Partnerships in Saudi Arabia, for example, being one manifestation of that, where the view now is that, well, we cannot just continue to spend and procure these goods and services. We now need to introduce measures where our own nationals gain the knowledge and the technology and the know-how to be able to produce these products locally, to be able to provide the services locally, and present yet another source of revenue where we're no longer just purchasing, we're now manufacturing, and so indigenous manufacturing as yet another example. And then I would add as just one final reform that we're seeing also, I believe, at the tail of the oil crisis and drop, the various reforms to attract foreign investment. And that has been manifested in multiple ways, removing various sectors off of negative lists, which have historically prohibited foreign investment in a way that counters many of the commitments of the states under World Trade Organization following the joining of the World Trade Organization, or the way that disputes are now being resolved, allowing for foreign investors to engage in arbitration rather than very uncertain and onerous dispute resolution in local courts under Islamic law that can be subject to multiple interpretations and throwing disputes into a great deal of uncertainty. So I think all of these, yes, are essentially been accelerated by the crisis, but they were in the works in the years prior there too.
Thank you. In recent days, S&P has forecasted that the GCC countries alone will need $300 billion of external financing to be able to stymie up balance sheets. So part of that would be external financing, and part of that would be asset sales, the largest country of which would need to be Saudi Arabia. So, in the last few years, we've seen the GCC countries be these kind of, debut bond issuances, right, which have been heavily oversubscribed. I think what's fascinating to note is, we had very much a virgin bond issuance, and we've moved into the debutante territory, right? And now the question becomes, will we have a much more sort of unchaste version of this issuance going forward? Do you think this will become kind of an addiction like we've seen in advanced economies? One, and two, do you think that there will be any hesitation? Last few years, majorly oversubscribed by foreign investors, particularly investors in Europe and America. Do you think that, given recent geopolitical events, there might be a tepid audience for that?
I think it's hard to answer those questions because so much of the economies in the Middle East and in the GCC in particular are driven by oil prices. And as we've seen the last 3 years, the recovery of oil, we've also seen increases in revenue, deficits as a percentage of GDP decreasing. In Saudi Arabia this past year, it was roughly 4.8%, about half of what it was last year. We're seeing this continuous steady growth. And as Saudi Arabia does well, the entire region does well, because Saudi Arabia is it's the elephant in the room. It's the largest economy in the Middle East. It's the major trade partner of all the GCC countries.
Well, not all of them.
Well, okay. I mean, until recently, it was the major trade partner. And in fact, I mean, Qatar was still a major exporter of natural gas. And I mean, this is a recent phenomenon that you're referring to. So, I mean, there's just so many different reports and predictions out there, one of which you're citing. But much of what I've read has been far more optimistic. And the view being that, I mean, despite what we saw today in the oil prices, that there'd be a continued increase, that next year we would see price per barrel, US dollars per barrel up to 75, about 6-7% increase over this year, and that this would continue for the next 5 to 6 years. I believe Oxford Business Council put out a report on that. You might see some of the citations in the handouts, the Dentons handout that some of you might have. If that is the trend going forward, I wouldn't be so concerned.
And I think that's the expectation. Just sorry to interrupt. You asked about sort of the outlook for energy demand, but in the near to medium term, even though there are questions about whether they'll cut production, we saw His Excellency Khalid Al-Falih, the energy minister, say Saudi would increase production capacity. ADNOC recently announced increases in production capacity. Kuwait's growing production capacity. So the GCC countries are preparing to expand production capacity, notwithstanding concerns about the longer-term oil demand outlook. Or
the longer-term price of oil, which is interesting because, I mean, the oil-rich countries can afford it, and in a sense they benefit from it. I mean, Saudi Arabia could have easily cut back production in 2014 and benefited from a decrease in supply and an increase in prices, and it opted not to because it realized that in the long term, obviously Saudi Arabia, in the short term, Saudi Arabia is hurt, is damaged by the low oil prices, but in the long term, countries trying to extract oil, for example, in the U.S. and Canada, where it's far more expensive, are much more easily dissuaded by low oil prices and much more apt to abandon their ambitions for joining the world oil markets, thereby allowing Saudi Arabia to continue its hegemonic status as the world's leading exporter of oil.
Looking just beyond GCC to Egypt, I mean, Egypt has had one of the best performing equity markets in the first half of 2018. I think on the macro side, things are very impressive. Recent months, even despite having a high energy import bill, you know, we've seen a huge reduction in the government fiscal deficit. How's Egypt looking to you these days?
I mean, Egypt is one of the countries where if I had $1 million, I would invest right now. I mean, it's doing phenomenally well. From a macroeconomic perspective, from an economic fiscal perspective, from a political perspective, from a political stability perspective, from an equity perspective. I mean, the equity market, it's a leading equity market, outperforming even Saudi Arabia, which also is a leading equity market. Saudi Arabia is doing very well. Tadawul is continuing to do very well. This year, it closed. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I believe the charts might have them, but it closed at some phenomenal 50% higher than I believe last year. I mean, don't quote me on that, but it did extremely well. Egypt is doing even better. And I think that's due to a couple of different factors. One, Egypt is doing well politically. I mean, the recent events in the country have shown that following Arab Spring, there was a great deal of violence, political, religious in nature, but that has tapered off. I mean, we're still seeing claims by insurgent groups, non-state armed groups, self-proclaimed Islamic State of Egypt, and whatnot, continuing to act. But the overall activities, I think, have decreased, and I think there's more confidence in Egypt as a major player and as the major destination and source of foreign investment across Egypt, across Africa, and the leading destination, a target of foreign investment in Africa. And I also think it's due to perhaps, to a certain extent, the fiscal policy, reducing interest rates, reducing the lending rates, which has in turn spurred a greater deal of investment and as well as investment into into equities.
Thank you so much.